he remains as feisty and combative as ever, as you'll find out fairly soon. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Newman.
Feisty as ever, but I have to change eyeglasses and so on for this thing. Thank you very much, Phil. In Hausa, there's the word for friend, which is aboki. But there's another word, which is amini, which means more than friend, but someone's really close friend, someone who's your confidant, someone you can really count on over the years. And I've been very fortunate to have Phil as a colleague and amini, a trusted friend for, well, we don't like to mention the years. It makes it sound like we're moving up. But for many, many years, and I really appreciate this friendship that we've had over the years, and thank you very much for such a gracious introduction. I appreciate that. I also need to thank and acknowledge other people who made this visit possible. A longtime colleague, Graham Furness, who's here in the front, helped organize this visit. Martin Owen, I'm not sure if he's here, but also helped with arrangements, enabled us to at least get in the library, not explain to us how to use it, but at least get in the library. And I also would particularly like to thank Peter Austin and Julia Sellebank for inviting me, unless I invited myself, I can't remember which, but anyway, on giving me this forum to express some of my ideas about field work and in relation to endangered languages. Just one more note of background. Phil is correct that I've had a long contact with SOAS over the years, going back many years, that there's a photo, a wonderful photograph taken on the front steps of SOAS on a Hamido-Semitic, it was called then, Afro-Asiatic conference that was held here at SOAS in 1970. And there's this fabulous photo, and if any of you look there and want to really look at the history of African linguistics, it's sort of fun, I'm sure, is to go through and see who you can identify, who you can't in the photo. I think there's a really handsome young man with an afro and a beard, and maybe you can identify who that is, but there are also other kinds of important scholars. And just one last note about my relationship with Greenberg, which is, and this is the truth, when I first came to SOAS for a visit, it was very nice, and then in the afternoon, I don't think the Commons room was where it is now. My memory is that it was in a different room, a bit more formal, and I was told, you can go in there to have tea in the afternoon in the Commons room, but don't mention Greenberg's name. So I didn't do it, but I'm allowed to do it now. All right. So I think I will get into the discussion today. Hopefully many of you came here because you're interested in field work, that you're interested in endangered languages, you're interested in the interplay of the two, and that my somewhat provocative title helped draw a large audience. But I'm going to be giving this talk not in a spirit of polemics, as much as Phil said, that I speak my mind on things. I'm not shy when it comes to expressing my opinion. But this is not meant as a polemic talk. It's a way of expressing what I consider to be some errors that have crept into the field over the last number of years. And this is why I call the law of unintended consequences, that sometimes out of proper and well-meaning motivation, certain errors creep into science. And I think it's the job of someone to step up and say, well, let's think about this, and maybe we can improve what we're doing. As far as the endangered language is concerned, I don't have to really give a historical background to this. Many of you know much more about it than I do. One can start a quote somewhere around 1991. There's a statement by Stephen Worm, who commented, "Every language reflects a unique worldview and culture complex. With the death of a language, an irreplaceable unit in our knowledge and understanding of human thought and worldview has been lost forever." And this is the message of any number of people working in the endangered languages field. Harrison, Michael Krauss has expressed this, that there is a loss going on, and we have concern about this. Okay. Not only that, but we have a professional and moral responsibility to do something about it, namely to document and record endangered languages before they die away. Back in 1998, I gave a paper at a conference where I lamented the fact that people were talking about problem of endangered language, but no one was doing anything. And as I saw it, the problem was not a lack of interest in endangered languages. There was an interest in endangered languages, which is why there were so many conferences. But there was a lack of interest in empirical field research at the time. Almost nothing had been published on fieldwork since Samarin's book, some 30 years earlier than that time. And fieldwork courses at American universities had a secondary status if they were offered at all. And the low prestige of fieldwork and linguistics in relation to formal theory can be illustrated in any number of ways, but just to give one anecdote, which has to do with this book that Martha Ratliff and I edited. The idea of this book came out of the LSA Committee on Endangered Languages, of which I was a member at the time, and people said, well, how can we get people interested in field work? And the suggestion was, well, why not do a book where we have productive field workers, have them write about their experiences, something about field work, and maybe this will inspire people to do this. And everyone said, this is a wonderful idea. And we said, well, who will edit it? And Nancy Dorian said, well, I'm kind of busy now. And Tony Woodbury said, well, I'd love to, but I'm busy. And I don't know. I'm a sucker for these things. I said, okay, I'll do it. And so I had lined up, and I say Martha Ratliff and I did this. Martha Ratliff is not an Africanist. She works on Hmong, Southeast Asian languages. I didn't want this to be an Africanist book, and so we worked together on this. And we had lined up a number of very distinguished authors. Ken Hale, Dan Everett, Marianne Methune, Nancy Dorian herself. And so I said, this is going to be easy. We've got all these outstanding authors, and so let me just find a publisher and we'll get working on it. And I contacted one publisher after another, and no one was interested in considering the project. Not that they were turning down the book, they would not even consider it. They said, we publish linguistics books. We don't publish books on fieldwork. This is 1998. We're talking about barely 15 years ago, and that was the state of linguistics at the time. So, as it turns out, there are some advantages in being a bit older, not many, and your back hurts and so on. But one of the advantages is that you know people. And I had a good friend, the late Jessica Cooper, who was an editor at Cambridge University Press. She, in fact, was not the linguistics editor. She was an anthropology editor. And I approached Jessica with the idea. And she said, well, is there a market for such a book? And I says, Jessica, I won't answer that question, but what I will say is there will be a market for such a book. Right. Let's do it, all right? And so she was very courageous and managed to help push it through Cambridge Press. So the book came out with Cambridge Press, not some third-rate publisher, but a major publisher, a major book with good authors. And I'm happy, and I can say of my various esoteric works, this book has gone out of print. I think it's now available on print on demand and what have you, but it has turned out to be a very successful book. Okay, so this tells you some of the background about this. Now, what's happened since? When I gave this paper about, and I think that was another one of provocative titles. I think it was The Endangered Languages as a Hopeless Cause. I'm good at these titles. In that case, I was terribly wrong, and I'm happy to be wrong, right? Because endangered languages work has absolutely thrived. in that period. There are endangered languages centers, such as the major center that you have here. There are special summer fieldwork courses, both in Europe, in the States, and in Africa. There are numerous colloquia and conferences. There is focused funding for people who want to do work on endangered languages. There's even occasionally academic positions. You're lucky there are any academic positions nowadays in linguistics, but there are positions now where people mention we want someone who has fieldwork experience, someone who has endangered languages experience. Just this year I've seen two, one at Santa Barbara and one at University of British Columbia. Remarkable, something that would have been unthinkable 15 years ago. There are a number of new fieldwork books that have come out. We had trouble getting this one out, but since then there have been 3, 4, I can't even count them, quite serious, good books. Some you like, better than others, but a number of important fieldwork books that have come out. New journals have come out. And I think most notably, I like to think of the Hawaii Journal of Language Documentation and Preservation. It's a journal on which I was on the initial editorial board, not because I knew anything about endangered languages, but because they were able to get free copyright advice for setting up the journal, and so on. Now, the above surprising developments go far beyond what we ever could have anticipated. This is remarkable and something to be applauded. However, the success of what I will refer to, and I don't know if you like the term, endangered languages movement, I think at least that's better than Bob Dixon's term, endangered languages fad. That the endangered languages movement has spawned what I consider to be unsound practices and ideas that in just a brief period of time have become increasingly entrenched in the field. In my presentation today, I shall discuss what I consider to be misguided ideas regarding linguistic fieldwork, which are espoused explicitly or implicitly by leaders and rank and file in the endangered languages movement. These errors can be grouped into 3 categories, namely, what language to study, 2, what aspect of a language should one study, and 3, methodologically, how should one go about doing field research. So, we will start. 1, choice of a language. Assumptions. The first assumption is that endangered languages are intrinsically more worthy of study than non-endangered languages. There are people who hold this point of view. Right. Now, if we leave social responsibility aside, and we leave aside, people's bleeding heart, feel-good attitudes, this is not self-evident that working on an endangered language is preferable to working on a non-endangered language. Any linguist who is a scientist needs to provide scientific justification for why he or she wants to work on a language. Why do you want to work on language X rather than language Y? It's not random. There should be a reason for this. And in my opinion, the fact that something is an endangered language is not in itself enough. Choice depends on one's scientific objectives. If classification is what you're concerned about, then you want to pick a language whose relationship to other languages is not established, or whose subgrouping status is unclear, or a language that appears to be an isolate rather than a member of some well-described family. If your interests are typological, then you want a language that promises to add to your interests or that seem aberrant in some way. For example, Tangali, which is one of some 125 Chadic languages that has a sort of a West African type ATR vowel harmony system. That's a language that's typologically strange in terms of where it is found. If you're a theoretician, and some of my best friends are theoreticians, you want to pick a language that allows you to test theories, right? In a note by Bob Dixon, he says, the worst reason to study a language is to the worst reason to study a language is to prove some theory. No, I agree with him. If you're supposed to go out there and only find data that proves the theory, we agree. But the idea that somehow it's wrong to go out and pick a language specifically to test some hypothesis, some theory of generality, that to me is what science is about. You have an idea and you want to put it to the test. That's a good reason to pick a language. Ultimately, one wants to pick a language that is interesting. Now, contrary to what we teach in Introduction to Linguistics classes, where, at least when I used to teach them, you tell the students that all languages are equally complex, right? All languages are equally expressive, all languages are equally interesting. But deep down, I don't believe that, you know. It turns out that from a scientific point of view, perspective, some languages are more interesting than others, right? Depending upon what you're looking at. For example, a language with 5 tones, if you are a tonologist, a language with 5 tones is going to be more interesting than a language with no tones. I mean, that's pretty self-evident, all right? Or, if you're interested in morphology, you may say, well, let's see, how do you form plurals in Terra? This is the language that I did my dissertation research on, and for every noun, and I did it properly, for every noun that I collected the singular, I collected the plural. The plural in Terra is indicated by a suffix, ku. Every word. There are 2 differences. I think men and women, man and men and woman and women, have some kind of suppletive. But for all the other, you add ku. Hausa has some 40 or so different ways of forming plurals. You can do some kind of taxonomy. Clearly, if you are interested in their inflectional morphology, Hausa is more interesting than Terra. So, the assumption that an endangered language is necessarily the language to work on, I think is something you have to think about. Second, come out of the endangered languages work is the idea that working on a previously undescribed language is better than working on a language that has already been described. Okay, why? We all accept this. Right? And if a student came to me and says, you know, I'm going to northern Nigeria, I'm trying to work on a language, maybe I'll go work on Terra. And I'll say, why work on Terra? I worked on Terra. The next one over, Jara, no one's worked on. Do Jara, all right? But there are good reasons for working on a language that's already been described rather than one that has not been described. Think about it. For example, languages become more interesting the deeper you get into them. Okay? In many ways, what one learns, with great difficulty, during the first 6 months working on a new language is often linguistically not very interesting. All right? At the shallow surface level, a language will be similar to related, already described languages, and one doesn't have to be an extreme Chomskyan to recognize that languages share properties by virtue of being languages. The advantage of working on an already described language is that one can build on what was done before. For example, take Margi, a language described by Carl Hoffman many years ago. Fabulous description done in the published 1960s, I believe, with all sorts of, you look at Margi and you say, God, I'd like to know this and this and this and this about it, but you have something to work from, all right? Moreover, the person working on a more described language may be the person who did it himself. Right? Notice, if I go out and do to do field research, why should I necessarily work on a new language rather than go back and work on a language that I did before? Of course, I didn't do that. When I went back, after working for Terra, I went back to northern Nigeria and I worked on Konakuru, which in many ways I'm happy I did, but it's because it never occurred to me that working on Terra was an option. I think that is an option. It's something we should think about. You can say I want to do a new, you can say I want to do a new language, but there's also nothing wrong with going back and working on the language you worked on before. So one benefits from skill and experience, and if you do it again, you probably do a better job. The third assumption is that working on a small language with few speakers, which is a characteristic of endangered languages, is better than working on a big language. All right? There are lots of reasons for the opposite. For example, if you deal with a big language, there's often availability of texts. Some of these languages have a written literature. Big or middle-sized languages often have a community of speakers interested in promoting their own language, so you get enthusiastic support. Big languages may have educated, linguistically trained native speakers with whom one can interact. Nowadays in linguistics, it's fashionable to use the term consultant for what used to be called informants, all right? But political correctness aside, it's great to have consultants. And if you work on a big language such as Hausa, where there are native speakers who have PhDs and have studied linguistics, you can have access to real consultants, people who can look over your work, criticize it, and discuss it with you. And finally, in big languages, you're not just the Lone Ranger working on the language alone. There are other colleagues in America, in England, in Europe, in Nigeria, that you can discuss matters with. There are lots of advantages in working on a big language. In sum, studying an endangered language may make you feel virtuous, and it may even help you get a grant. But scientifically speaking, it may be a poor choice. May not necessarily be, but it could be. Second question, choice of what you're going to study. And we'll start with what I call the language and culture fallacy. The whole language and culture fallacy. And this is the notion that's been propagated by certain proponents of documentary linguistics that you're supposed to study, quote, the entire language and culture. All right? Now let's get real, okay? Which linguists have the anthropological training and skills to undertake a professionally proper study of culture and worldview? No cultural anthropologist would have the temerity to say, well, I'm going out there and I'm going to be doing some kinship and I want to find out residence patterns and so on. And while I'm there, I'm going to study the language and do a grammar. And yet the idea that linguists should somehow or other go to the field and work out kinship systems, culture, worldview, etc., is just ridiculous. But even if you leave culture out of it, so we'll say, okay, forget about culture, let's go back to just whole language. The requirement that one study the entire language is fraught with problems. The whole language fallacy leads to the idea that researchers have to collect material sufficient to do a full grammar, full dictionary, and text. But the essence of science is choice and focus. Good research planning requires realism, and the reality is that man is mortal, time is short, and funds are limited. You can't do everything. No, in practice, this kind of three-dimension, grammar, dictionary text leads to, in the case of dictionaries, fairly limited word lists rather than dictionaries. The so-called dictionaries are done in a haphazard way by researchers with little understanding of lexicography. I've done dictionaries. It's a dog of a job, right? And with text, the problem is the opposite. If the problem with dictionaries is that they're too small and limited, the problem with text is that people collect too many. Right? There's a misguided emphasis on collecting more and more and more text, and we're long far beyond what you would have the time to transcribe and analyze properly. And that is, if you do a cost-benefit analysis of doing text, what you find is text collection drains time and energy from serious research. Now, texts do have a value, but where texts are most useful is not something to be stored away for the distant future, in fact, never to be used by anyone else, but as a guide to analysis and research while you are in the field. And for this, you only need a couple of good texts. Third, and if I'm going to limit myself to grammar, as opposed to dictionary and text, insisting that this first description of an endangered language be a full comprehensive grammar is also an unsound and unrealistic requirement. There is no reason why we couldn't or shouldn't focus on some part of a language. Of course, we all know that at some level, languages consist of integrated, interdependent components. This is the famous dictum variously ascribed to de Saussure and to Millet, "La langue est un système où tout se tient." All right? It's a language where everything holds. All right? As a result, if you focus on one part, people say, well, you may miss something important. Well, guess what? That's the way research is. You just can't anticipate everything. But in fact, what you can do is work on some aspect of a language independent of, as a discrete object of study, independent of the others. Now, later you may discover, I was doing this, and I discovered later I really did need tone, and I was ignoring it, I was doing something in syntax. You go back and you do it. But you can cut things apart and pick what you want to work on. And why not? Some parts of a language are more interesting than others, or they're more they're more relevant to the interests and abilities of the linguist. For example, the complex structure of tone, the phonetics of glottalized consonants, the nature of numeral systems, the gender assignment of loanwords, the existence and function of pluractional verbs, the form and meaning of idiophones, etc., etc. These things can be, you can cut it out and say, that is what I am going to do. Now, at some point, a linguist may want to do a full grammar. May be foolish enough to want to do that. And my 800-page, nearly 800-page, 760-page grammar of Hausa is something that I undertook, and it represents a quarter of a century of work. It's not something that came out of 9 months in the field. But this is not something that you have to do, and it's certainly not something that would be expected of a field linguist working on a new language for the first time. Let me now turn to fieldwork methodology. Here the assumption is the endangered language's tragedy compels a sense of urgency and panic. Everybody get your running shoes on. We've got to move fast. All right. And this is what spawned something that is called documentary linguistics. If you know something about documentary linguistics, try to forget it. And if you don't know, you're lucky. Because documentary linguistics represents a return to naive empiricism at its worst. This sense of urgency says, just go out and collect data. Well, this is not science. This is butterfly collecting, to use an old term of Chomsky's. No, when you think, well, the way I characterize documentary linguistics is just people rushing in there and collecting, mindlessly collecting data, I'm not making this up. I wish I were. Let me quote Himmelmann, where he says, "The core of a language documentation consists of a corpus of audio or video recordings of more or less naturally occurring communicative events." Okay. And then he goes on. "With regard to the economy of research resources, it may be more productive to spend more time on expanding the corpus of primary data rather than to use it for writing a descriptive grammar." All right, collect data, forget about writing. All right, okay. Peter Austin, who's here, who's kindly invited me to give this talk, I couldn't resist, I have to quote him, right? "For language documentation, then, data collection, representation, and diffusion is the main research goal, with grammars, dictionaries, and text collections as secondary dependent products." Okay. Claire Bowen, who's written, I think, quite a good fieldwork book, again says similar types of things, says you should record as much good quality data as possible, even if you do not have time to analyze it. My question is, how do you know what's good quality data? You know what good quality data is because you're analyzing as you go along. And as you go along, you find what to work on and what not. You don't collect 2,000 nouns with ku as the plural, if you have any sense, which I didn't then, all right? Okay. Bowen continued, if the basic materials aren't there, they can't be recovered later on. Again, it sounds reasonable, but it leads to really unused archives, what Layman has called linguistic data cemeteries, right? That if you bring back unanalyzed data, no one is going to use it. This is the fact. It's bad diffusion and it's bad field work. You have to analyze in the field, and you should write in the field. I finished a draft of my dissertation while I was in the field, before I came back to the States. It's rather than analyzing for years. And Layman points out, good documentation requires the addition of interpretive information, which is not inherent in the primary data, but generated by the author of the documentation. The mere collection and reproduction of raw data is not a scientific activity at all. Very clear. I'm going to skip the next one, is another weakness of this kind of documentary linguistic approach is the lack of opportunity to speak the language. And linguists have done a bad job of learning to speak the language that they're studying. Endangered languages research furthers this bad practice. In many cases, endangered languages are endangered because of the breakdown of the speech community. All right? And Crowley pointed out that the authors of most published grammars are surprisingly reticent about their own conversational abilities in languages in question. You know, that linguists really don't talk about learning to speak the language. There's a tremendous value in doing this. You learn so much if you can do this. And unfortunately, a reality of endangered languages research is often this is not a real opportunity. Why? Because what often goes first before the language being endangered is the culture is gone, the community has dissolved. And the speakers of endangered languages often are not in the community. This one you find here living with some son-in-law, and this one is here. So it is a real loss that you can't learn to speak the language. Interestingly, and going back to what I was saying before about large versus small languages, is linguists who do learn to speak the object of study tend to work on large languages. So those of us, you know, speak Hausa. Phil speaks it well. Roxana speaks it well. I barely speak it, but that's okay. I'm a linguist. I can be excused. But this is because it's Hausa. I never learned to speak Hausa. I never learned to speak Terra. All of my Terra research was done through Hausa. And we get the feeling that, you know, I'm doing the native language, but actually it's not. It was the lingua franca, and I never learned to speak it. I would have been a much better grammar if I had. Another problem with endangered languages research is the failure to appreciate the value of good informants. This is something that Sapir recognized years and years ago. The main problem that we often do is not taking advantage of the linguistic smarts and intuition of native speakers, some of whom are remarkably perspicacious and there is a huge potential return if one spends time and effort in training one's informants. When I was working on Terra, I had a super informant who had sharp insights, an incredible feel for the language. In Dixon's book, he talks about one of his informants who was a natural linguist, and given educational opportunity, as he said, she could have done my job. It is ironic with regard to informants that whereas most field workers have switched to the politically correct term consultant, they nonetheless still treat their speakers as mindless corpus producers, which is what you want to do in documentary linguistics. You want data. You don't want analysis. You don't want to ask their opinion. You don't want their Sprachgefühl. You don't want their thoughts about the language. You want to collect raw data and in a sense ignore their potential as informants. Of course, Finding a good informant takes time and a multitude of choices among your speakers, and unfortunately, working on an endangered language, you don't have that choice. They're not available. Another problem methodologically is the overemphasis on what I would call monolithic long-term projects. The idea that research is to document a previously undescribed language, covering the entire language, including grammar, dictionary, and so on, means that one necessarily is thinking of a long-term project. We're thinking of projects that take at least 9 to 12 months, right? We're not thinking of somebody who says, I'm going to zip over to the reservation or whatever it is, and during my spring break and get some work in 2 weeks. But who can get away? Who's free to get away for 9 months a year? All right? Well, it tends to be young, inexperienced PhD students, many of whom are not yet quite ready for the task. And by the way, I think Crowley talks about this, in many ways work on endangered languages is harder than working on non-endangered languages. There are all kinds of social and psychological problems, especially if you're working with older speakers and you're a young person and have not had that experience of working with older people, some of whom have bad health problems, they have financial problems. It is a difficult thing, and to send a PhD student in his or her 20s out there to work on these languages, this is a tough task. And Crowley says they should be doing other languages, and it's the experienced linguists who should be doing endangered languages. In medicine, new MDs normally do medical internships before undertaking complex, life-depending operations on their own. By the time they're finished with a research period, young PhD students may have the requisite skills, but at the beginning they're being thrown to the wolves. There's a contradiction here. The endangered languages movement views endangered languages as the most important critical language deserving of documentation and description, and then they send out the least experienced, least qualified linguists to work on them. And last, the problem of verification and incomplete work. Lack of opportunity for follow-up research by others to verify one's findings is a real problem in linguistics in general, and a particular problem when you're dealing with a language which may not be there sometime in the future. This has long been a problem in linguistics. Someone goes in the field, they write something, and all of us are naive enough to believe it. In the real world of science, no one believes it. Someone sends results. The first thing a scientist does says, I want to replicate it. I don't just start arguing against it, questioning it. I say, is it so? And there are scholars whose work I will leave nameless. There are scholars I will leave nameless whose work I look at and I say, I don't believe it. I don't believe the facts. I don't believe it's so. All right? I hate to say this, but I don't believe it. All right? And this is something that, how do we find out? Well, because we go back and verify it. There's a real problem with endangered languages that we don't have this opportunity. And if you add the fact that the linguists doing it are inexperienced, it just adds to the problem. So we have a problem with working on an endangered language that someone says, someone's going to go out there and they're going to find some phenomenon that has never been reported before. This is the argument that, God, if we don't study it, it's going to be lost forever, and we got to do it because they're going to find something that's never been recorded before, and if it's never been recorded before, and it's never been verified by someone else, who's going to believe it and change their theory? I doubt it. It's going to sit there, people say, well, so-and-so said this language has 7 levels of tone, right? And are we going to change our theories about tone? And the answer is no. So, in sum, endangered language research encourages study of the wrong language, wrong aspects of the language, and an approach to fieldwork encompassing a wrong methodology. What one should be doing is devoting one's limited time and resources to doing methodologically sound research on a language or a group of languages, in the case of survey work, which we haven't even talked about, that offers the greatest prospect of leading to the discovery of matters of significant linguistic interest. Otherwise, you are just collecting more archival data to end up in the linguistic cemetery. Now, the fact that positive results have come from endangered languages research, despite the flawed underpinnings, is a testimony to the dedication of the young, usually, scholars who do this. And they really do deserve our praise and admiration. I'd like to conclude with some constructive suggestions. All things being equal, you could say, all things being equal, of course, study an endangered language. All right, so we agree. Unfortunately, all things are never equal. All right? And my contention is that someone proposing to do research in an endangered language has to make a strong case why this particular language deserves study. The fact of being an endangered language is not enough. If an endangered language truly warrants study, and if one truly believes in the value of endangered language documentation and preservation, then one has a scientific and moral responsibility to do it right. What is not right is 9 to 12 months of field research by a single PhD student who madly collects data and then goes back and writes up a thesis of theoretical ideological interest, or even worse, spends the time preparing data to be deposited into some fancy archive. For reasons of verification and adequacy, one should have at least 2 people study the same language. If it's worth doing by one, then one should do it by 2. And if one of the people is a PhD student, or better still, a postdoc who at least has a little bit more training, then ideally the other person should be someone, a more experienced linguist, who should be present in the field for at least some period of time. That person doesn't necessarily have to be there for the whole period, but there for some time. One should also have follow-up fieldwork trips built in the design of the research and design of the project. A follow-up fieldwork trip should be built in so that questions can be checked and data filled in. This, of course, implies that when you come back, you're going to analyze your data and look at it and not just put it in something. Having done that, then you find the gaps, then you find the lacunae, then you find the problems, then you find the questions that you wished you'd ask, and that you go back, and that the funding should be designed in advance with this in mind. Okay. I would say that if we really want to support endangered languages research, funding agencies and institutes that make these decisions should focus their resources on a smaller number of well-chosen endangered languages research projects rather than fund a large number of random projects, which may add up to nothing. This is not what we typically do, I think, in the Anglo-Saxon world, but there's a long tradition in former Soviet linguistics and universities and in Russian linguistics, where someone designs the project and tells students what you're going to work on. We don't like that. We believe in freedom of choice and all of this. But this may be one where we say it is for the people who run Endangered Languages Institute, who are able, better than the young student who's proposing the project, better able to say, here is our priority of languages that need to be worked on and what needs to be worked on with regard to these languages. And if you want to accept this opportunity and go with it, fine, but we're not going to just do the random things. This person wants to do this, wants to do that. Put more resources in less languages rather than spreading the resources out to a lot. I think the payoff will be greater in terms of our understanding and what we learn from endangered languages. Ideally, there should be some infrastructure in the field. Archaeologists and animal behavior people have had field stations for years. You know, they always have this, and it's a good place, and you go in there, and there's somebody with a Land Rover and a fridge that keeps the beer cold, and so on. We, unfortunately, have really not had this in linguistics. A few people have tried to do this. This would really be something of great value if one could have centers like this, whereby you say, you're going to go work in this area in northern Ghana, and guess what? We will handle some of the logistics for you, and then go in there and devote your time and skills and energies in doing the linguistic research. Despite my hopefully pertinent and constructive criticism, I, a lifelong field worker, remain a supporter of endangered languages research. But as a scholar who considers linguistics to be concerned with the scientific study of language, I approach the phrase endangered language research with a different emphasis. In my view, the terms are reversed. What should be first is research. Second, language, and only then endangered. Right? As a scientist, this scientific imperative supersedes the so-called moral imperative espoused by some of the early champions of the endangered languages movement. Scholars who feel a social responsibility to study endangered languages mean to do good. It is unfortunate that this has led to the abandonment of the tenets and practices of good science. Thank you very much.
Well, presentation encompassing claims and content, plenty to go out there. The floor is open.
Yes.
Well, I have two questions, but I think I'll just settle for one for the moment. I was interested when you said that sometimes the linguistic field workers didn't actually learn to speak the language.
Yes.
Now, this reminded me in my first degree, which was pre-linguistics, in which I did a couple of units in social anthropology. Likewise, you had field workers going out but studying social interaction and that sort of thing. Now, I got the impression that they always sat down and learned the language. Is there any sort of interaction these days between the linguists and the sociologists who must be doing parallel work even if they don't understand each other?
Thank you very much. This brings up what I refer to variously as the great anthropological lie, or the great anthropological fiction, or the great anthropological myth. Almost all ethnographies that are published, the authors give the impression that they did the research through the language of the people they studied. They don't talk about it, but they give that impression. In fact, it is rarely the case. Right? They don't talk about it because the ethos of anthropology and cultural anthropology and ethnography is that you should, but they don't. And so they don't do this, and I discussed this. I was talking to Cambridge at Cambridge the last week, and pointing out that as a result of this, anthropologists are never taught how to use an interpreter. They don't teach them how to use an interpreter because the fiction is they're going to learn the language in the field, and they seldom do. So this is a problem shared by linguists and anthropologists, and I think that it's something worth discussing, which is what is the payoff. And it may be, even for linguists, that it is worth saying, I'm going to go to the field and I'm going to do the first, let's say I have a 10-month grant, that I'm going to do the first 3.5 months language learning, because that's the only way you're going to learn it. There are a few very skillful polyglots in the world, my colleague Larry Hyman and a few others, who can go there and learn the language. For the rest of us, people don't learn a language just by being there. It doesn't happen. You learn a language if you say, I am going to spend my time learning the language. And so the question you have to ask, and it'd be nice to, one would love to do a study of this and say, one person spends 9 months, they go in, they do traditional research, they don't learn the language, they've got 9 months worth of research. The other person spends the first 4 months doing nothing but language learning and social connections and so on, and then has 5 months devoted to research. Who's going to come out with better research results? I don't know. I really don't know the answer to that, but it's a good question that we should ask. But no, this is one case where the linguists actually have nothing to learn from the anthropologists, other than the fact that I think the linguists sort of admit that they don't do it, and no one ever tells them they're supposed to. No one ever even suggested to me that when I go in the field that I should learn to speak the language. And in fact, in Bill Samarin's Grammar of Sango, which was done many years ago, he apologizes for knowing Sango. And he says, but I promise you, I put my intuition away so that I could do an objective study. You can go read the introduction to Sango grammar. I'm not making this up. So, thank you. Nice point. Yes. Yes.
Your neighbour.
Yes.
Oh yeah, just a point on language learning. When I was doing my field research for my PhD I've just been doing, I did put some time into learning the language, and I really found it was extremely useful for so many reasons.
Right.
I was able to follow conversations. If you're just sitting down listening to people, you can pick up things and kind of test ideas you have which you couldn't do otherwise. And also, one thing which I thought was really crucial was that in the eyes of the language community that I was working with, I think if I hadn't spoken the language, nobody would take me seriously there.
Yes.
Because they say, oh, so, okay, you're learning language, so what can you say, what can we talk about? That's people's kind of conception of somebody who's working with them, is that you'll be able to do this. And if you could say, well, I know that your language has retroflex stops in it, or something. That's
right.
what I found out up to now. Not really the same kind of credibility
Right.
in the community.
There's a wonderful chapter in this book by Fiona McLaughlin and Tiano So, which is a chapter by the linguist and her assistant talking about fieldwork. It's very seldom that you get this in the same chapter. And she, the community understood she was there to study the language, and what the assistant commented on was that the members of the community criticized him for being such a lousy teacher because this European woman wasn't learning the language. So, something to work. On the side. Yes.
I think I don't agree with your view of the data symmetry. And I tell you why. I have two examples. I used to want to work on Chaga, which is spoken in northern Tanzania. And it's very interesting. They have object mark, and you can't object mark with the lexical object, but you have to object mark with the pronoun. So I was interested in that. And I spoke to Wilhelm Möhlich, a professor from Cologne, and he said, no point working on Chaga, it's done.
Right.
Don't even do it. And I said, that's interesting, I know there's not much around. My cousin has done it. The cousin had indeed done it, a gentleman called Winter, and all his materials were in his attic. All his description of Chaga was in his attic, unpublished, handwritten notes. I never met the man. So effectively, for me, it doesn't help me that Herr Winter has worked on Chaga. I still haven't been, but I would go.
Yes.
But the second example is I have a colleague from Gothenburg, Martin Petzer. She worked again in Tanzania, small language Kavulu. She has deposited here in our archive, and I just browsed along the archive as one does, and found the little text and thought it's really, really interesting. I didn't understand it. Then again, went back to her and asked her, and now we have a very lively discussion about exactly this data. These were not data she could have published in, maybe in a big grammar, but she has published the grammar. It's not in the grammar. It's not a journal article type thing. So the Winter example says that if you have your field materials and put them in the attic, that's it. That's a real symmetry.
Right.
The Marlin example says that if you put your materials into an archive which is accessible, and it has to be a certain standard. So there was a translation and a transcription. It wasn't just random text, but it wasn't analyzed in a deep sense. That then may lead to to that sort of academic exchange, which otherwise would have through publication. I think what it needs is you need an educated readership, if you like, of the archive. The archive has to be has to be accessible enough that people like I, who don't work on the endangered language and don't spend lots of time on it, I want to just see the data. I have to get there fast. And I think depositors have to be clear that this is what we need to do in order to make it accessible. Once you have that, I think, for me personally, it's a real advantage to have that sort of archive material around, which, especially for African languages, otherwise you just wouldn't have access to.
I really can't disagree with you. What I think I was saying is that you want materials that are usable, right? And if you just dump raw data in, it's not easily accessible. Now, somebody who's a specialist in it may or may not use it, we don't know. But that can't be the end of itself. Now, going along with what you said, I had a PhD student some years ago who did a study of language games in Nigeria and Niger. And she did about seven languages, Hausa, Fulfulde, Tamashek, and so on. Wonderful PhD thesis. And so toward the end, she's saying, well, am I done? And I says, no, because you've got to deposit your notes and recordings in the archives at Indiana so that somebody later can go back and double check your transcription and so on. So I'm sort of taking an extreme case, and I say, I didn't invent the term linguistic cemetery, that was somebody else. So I think there's a point to it, but I still would say that the idea that that's all you do, you go in the field and you get this, for a linguist, I think you need to do more. You want them organized, they have to be transcribed. I mean, I have 13 notebooks filled with Terra texts, which went to all the trouble of transcribing. I don't know who and what is going to do with it, and it really is a problem. What do we do with these things? Bad handwriting and so on. So your point well taken. I accept it.
Yeah, as a follow-up to what Lutz said, I can only support that point. But also, I can see that your criticism is really relevant, because there is a tendency, I think, within endangered languages research to not see the scientific needs first and foremost, but to be motivated by this concern to want to preserve something for the future.
Yeah.
And what would, entirely unclear who is going to benefit. And that has been criticized from within language documentation as well. For instance, Tony Woodbury has criticized this very often prevalent ancestral code mode of language documentation that picks what the speech community feels they're losing, so the more archaic language modes, etc., the most conservative forms, etc., and has said that's not scientific, it's understandable, but it's not scientific. Frank Seifert, in a paper on corpus design, has distinguished 3 types of sampling: externally motivated, which also follows needs to do good or preserve culture, very often motivated again by ideologies coming from the community, what they see as the most important genres, etc. And then what he sees as the backbone of language documentation, systematic sampling, that needs to be linguistically motivated. So there are people within language documentation who actually say, this is a scientific enterprise, and language documentation needs to actually be a branch of corpus linguistics.
Right.
If we document language use, it has to be real language use, but we also have to have the research questions that we want to answer with it. And so, people are thinking about it and doing it as well.
Thank you very much. That's a very useful comment.
David.
In your terms, I'm a linguistic undertaker, I suppose, because I'm the leader of the Endangered Languages Archive here. So just taking up on points that you made, so Frederica and Lutz, I suppose what disappoints me is that a lot of the arguments you used seem to be sort of rather straw men ones, but in contrast, in response to Lutz, you mentioned that yes, materials have to be usable and there's proper ways of assembling them and so on. And as Frederica mentioned, corpus linguistics and that kind of science is perhaps something we should be adhering closer to. And I wonder why you're a bit sort of so desperate, almost in the way that by which Chomsky has fallen out for so many of us, because there's only one view of what linguistic science should be. And some of us think that there are other kinds of possible sciences, and they might include things like corpus organization and such things as were mentioned by my colleagues. The other point more close to home is that whether it's our archive or the Dobas archive at Nijmegen or the Alaska Native Language Archive in Alaska, actually we have thousands of users and thousands of active users, and these are actually living archives, and it's a term we have used and we've worked hard to promote. So this is very, and Lutz's example was a case of that.
Right.
So this is very strongly contra that picture you gave of graveyards.
Maybe I shouldn't have used the term graveyard. It seemed a catchy phrase, and to sort of to capture the difference between storing raw data for the future, which is what people are thinking. I think there's a time element, which is, do we say, I have these materials and I'm going to do something with them as a linguist, or do we say, I'm collecting this for somebody else, I don't know who it's going to be in the future. Now, if people want to do that, that's fine, but as a scientist, I personally find it unsatisfying, that I want to do it now. I have questions now. And what do we know what the questions that people are going to be asking 20 years from now? We don't know. And so you'll find that the data may be useful, they may not be useful, we don't know. So I'm certainly not anti-archives. I do use old materials. One of the things I love about Hausa is that we have older materials. In fact, there's a wonderful Hausa dictionary published in 1906 by Mischlich. And I gave a paper a year or so ago, which was sort of a detective story. Why is J the last letter in the alphabet in Mischlich's Hausa dictionary? Right? And how did we find this out? If you actually get into it, you learn a lot about the language. But my impression was that I was the only one, and I'm an American, but this is a German dictionary, that none of my German colleagues had ever looked at Mischlich's dictionary. So this is the problem of older materials, is that you never know who is going to use them. So I'm not against archives. I think archives are fine. I just feel that you have, the more you analyze, we get back to what Boren talking about, what you want is good quality data. Good quality materials. And my feeling is, and I would still contend this, that random collecting is not going to get you good quality in the materials. The way you get good quality materials is looking for something. I mean, if I look in a microscope, all I'm going to see is my eyelash. I don't know what to look for, right? You find things in the field. Hausa is a language which has been studied 100 years, and until someone began looking carefully, they didn't even realize that the language had two different R's. The distinction is very small. It has a very, very low functional load. It turns out to be historically extremely important, but no one knew this. So the materials we had are useless from this point of view. So I think this is something where you say you want good quality material. Then if you want to put them in an archive, fine. But how do you get good quality materials? It's by having questions and focused research as you go along. So we're not that far apart, really. Yes.
Peter.
Oh, I'm sorry. You
Yeah, Peter.
I think many of the points that you made are well taken, and thank you for making them and for being so clear in the arguments that you made. I think if I had two comments. One is you talk about the kind of linguistic audience for our work and for archiving and so on.
Right.
There's another huge and growing constituency, and that is the speakers of these languages themselves, right, and the descendants of them. And quite frequently now, they are reliant on material that is being archived, whether it's analysed or not, in order to be able to support and revitalise and work on their languages. Mm-hmm. So that constituency is perhaps well served by some of the things that you have been decrying. Mm-hmm. The second comment I would make is people go where the money goes, and a lot of the stuff that you've been criticising sending young people out for long periods of time and so on, lone wolf, lone ranger linguists and so on. That's because that's the way the funding agencies are funding the work.
Yes.
You know, we've had examples fairly recently, students wanting to work together as a team on languages, students wanting to work on languages that are categorized as too big by the funding agency.
Right.
So the funding agency telling them, you're not allowed to work on that language in collaboration with somebody else. You're not allowed to work on that language because there's too many speakers. You're not allowed to work on that language because somebody's already done the work on that language.
Right.
So I think many of the criticisms that you've made could be equally leveled at the agencies that are supporting and funding this kind of work.
Just in response to the second question first, I think this is where you, here at SOAS, in the Rousing Center, where you have the prestige and position, it's do your best to educate these other funding agencies of the importance of this kind of work, of joint work, of follow-up work, and so on. Someone has to do it. Some emeritus retired professor at Indiana is not going to have any clout when it comes to what goes on at NSF and so on. And this is the sort of thing that I think can be discussed at Endangered Languages meeting. Those of you here, people at Yale, other people involved in the supporting this work, is to come up with, use best practices, in terms of funding, and maybe you can have some impact. But I agree with you, you're up against it, but I think it would have to come from you, not from those of us, individual scholars. In answer to the first question, I agree with you that this gets back to the notion that you have to do grammar, dictionary, text, and so on. I think in terms of native speakers and local communities, my experience is what they want is a dictionary. Grammar, I don't know. They don't exactly even know what a grammar is. They all want dictionaries. If you say, where are you going to put your time? If you let them decide, do it, and it's not a bad idea. But I think one has to understand that there are some that pulls and pushes, and that maybe the best work would be to do a good dictionary, which would then make it possible for the next person going out who did the grammar to say, I've got this huge corpus to work on. And in the course of doing the dictionary, if you do dictionaries, you're by nature an anthropologist, you have to be. You're by nature a phonetician, you have to be. You have to solve a lot of these problems. And so you can say, this is what the community wants. This is what they would like to support. I can get any number of members of the community to join in on this thing, and we go and we say, what we're going to do is a dictionary. That is different from saying, well, let's collect random materials because the native, local community wants it. I think they could use guidance. They want to preserve their heritage, and I think that the linguists and the agencies who support this can pick up and say, what people usually want is dictionaries, and it's feasible to do this, and this is interesting work. Problem, reality, is if a PhD student goes out and comes back and says, I did a dictionary, who's going to give them a thesis? I mean, who's going to accept that thesis for a PhD? And so we got a problem between the demands of university rules and what would be useful. Anyone who's ever done a dictionary realizes, that is multi-dimensional, multidisciplinary work. Dictionaries just are hard work and require a range of knowledge. You never know where it's going to end. But it's certainly one where members of the community will join in and participate and volunteer. And you're going to not have just one informant, if I can use the old term, but you're going to have lots of people. And you're going to discover that this one is good at phonetics, and this one is good at the names of trees, and this one is good at this, and what comes out of it is a good work. So I think you're absolutely right. I was approaching it from the point of view of an old-fashioned PhD in linguistics, professor of linguistics. But you're right that there's other work to do. But I think in certain areas like dictionary work, you can serve both communities.
Together with developing orthographies as well.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Thanks. I think you brought up a lot of really good points, and I also think that many of them are being discussed in language documentation right now. I just completed the MA here at SOAS a year or two ago. They were discussed quite frequently in the last year, which I think is good. had two short questions. One, you talked about making a strong case for why one should study a particular language, and I was wondering what your thoughts are about one reason being that speakers have requested a linguist to come and study the language, and if you think that that's a scientifically valid reason. And the second question was, I'd really like to hear more about your idea of what kind of infrastructure in the field would look like.
Okay. As far as being invited, one of the things, there's a nice chapter in this book by Ken Hale where he basically talks about some work he did, and the motivation for it was that people were inviting him. I mean, as much as I say, there's a certain sense from a scientific point of view, you want to say, I can justify working on this language because it's, for scientific reasons. The other is to say, whatever I work on, I'm going to find something interesting to do, and we've got to be pragmatic. It's what you mentioned about where funding is, and I won't say now because of what's going on in northern Nigeria with danger and rebellion and so on. But 20 years ago, if I had received a letter from a group of people speaking some language up in northern Nigeria, Maka or so on, saying, our community really would like to do this and this and we'd like to invite you out, I wouldn't stop and say, well, is this the best Chadic language? I'd say, this is the one where I'm going to get the best results because I'm going to get the best support. And so I think this is certainly a variable that you want to bring up. No, you may want to turn them down. You may want to say, I know they want me there and it will be great, but my interests are in so-and-so, and this just isn't a language that fits in with anything I'm interested in doing. And so you have to, play with it and balance the practical convenience with the